I am going to start in a second here.
Okay, great. Hey,
I'm sorry.
sounds good. I sort of I was driving there and kept getting dropped. Sorry about that.
There are other things to do. It's on live stream now.
Yay.
All right, so let's get on with this silliness here.
Yahoo.
Yahoo! Yeehaw! Welcome, welcome, welcome. 22nd of March. Welcome to Weekly Marks. It's a Saturday again. We're looking at Karl Marx Capital Volume I, Chapter 14, which appears as Chapter 16 in the previous versions of this. This is reading from the 2024 version, translation done by the two Pauls, Princeton University Press. I'll change it up a bit today because I'll read the first couple of paragraphs from the Ed George notes, which hopefully will give you some sense of why we're doing this. Absolute and relative surplus value. Our historical survey completed, we can now return to some of the theoretical issues related to the labor process in a more concrete way so as to develop them. You'll recall that the prior chapter was a bit on the long side, but it was a history. He was trying to give you a kind of sort of timeline for how this has happened. Number one, individual and social labor. This is Ed George. Earlier, we defined productive labor abstractly, independent of its historical forms. Abstractly because individualized, but human production is only exceptionally individual. The preceding historical account has precisely been an account of the increasingly social complexity of the labor process within which the direction is that in which the product is transformed from the direct product of the individual producer into a social product, that is, the joint product of a collective laborer. We should note here that the non antagonistic nature of solitary labor, certainly. Just as head and hand belong together in the system of nature, so in the labor process, mental and physical labor are united. The socialization of production brings increasingly so antagonism as mental labor becomes separated from physical labor and as the product is transformed from the direct product of an individual producer into the joint product of a collective of workers. Note, of course, the historical progression from um, guild work to, larger divisions of labor, as mentioned in the prior chapter. Number two, the notion of productive labor, still at George. All this supposes both a broadening and narrowing of the concept of productive labor. The broadening arises from the understanding that in order to work productively, it's no longer necessary for the individual himself to put his hand to the object. It is sufficient for him to be an organ of the collective laborer and perform any one of its subordinate functions. The narrowing from the fact that under capitalist production, which is not merely the production of commodities, but the production of surplus value, the productive worker, who produces not for herself, but for capital, is productive only insofar as she produces surplus value, i.e., contributes to the self valorization of capital. Thus, what determines whether or not labor is productive or not is the structure of social relations within which that labor is carried out. The concept of a productive worker therefore implies not merely a relation between the activity of work and its useful effect, between the worker and the product of his work, but also a specifically social relation of production, a relation with a historical origin which stamps the worker as capital's direct means of valorization. And number three, absolute and relative surplus value, formal and real subsumption of labor. This point made, Marx now returns in more detail certain concrete features of the historically specific character of capitalist production. He begins with the concepts of absolute and relative surplus value. He notes that the existence of the latter logically presupposes the prior existence of the former. The possibility of cheapening labor power by cheapening the commodities consumed by the laborer presupposes that the working day is already divided into necessary labor and surplus labor, i.e., that surplus value is already being produced. Now, in fact, while it is the production of absolute surplus value which forms the general foundation of the capitalist system, it is the production of relative surplus value which completely revolutionizes the technical process of labor and the groupings into which society is divided. The production of relative surplus value requires a specifically capitalist mode of production which arises spontaneously on the basis of the formal subsumption of labor under capital. Now, this formal subsumption is then replaced by a real subsumption. So this idea of a kind of evolution or substitution is really important, and it is part of the transformation, the idea of a transformation, and raises other questions about the differences among relative and absolute forms of surplus value in other manifestations. So I've included in this, of course, the notes from Harry Cleaver's course on Capital Volume I, which of course lists this as chapter 16, even though it is chapter 14 in the current version. And I added a little diagram and a little video from the interweb, and so I hope you'll find this useful. Chapter 14, Absolute and Relative Surplus Value, 2024, Capital Volume 1. We first considered the labor process in abstract terms, or apart from its historical forms, as a process that takes place between human beings and nature, see Chapter 5. When this process is purely individual, one and the same worker performs all its functions, uniting them and operating as his own supervisor as he appropriates natural objects to achieve his basic life aims. Later, he works under others, and the various functions of the labor process are distributed among multiple workers. An individual person working on his own can't apply the labor to nature without activating his muscles, which he controls with his brain. Just as the head and the hand go together in nature's system, so the labor process unites menial labor and mental labor. Those two things are eventually separated, however, to the point where a hostile antagonism emerges. The product is no longer an article made by an individual producer directly. It has become the collective product of a combined workforce, which consists of members working closer to or farther from the actual object of labor. And so as the cooperative character of the labor process becomes more expansive, the concept of productive labor necessarily expands, so as does that of its bearer, that is, the productive worker. But the latter concept narrows too. Capitalist production is, at bottom, the production of surplus value, not merely commodities. A worker produces for capital rather than himself, and it no longer suffices for a worker to generally produce. He must produce surplus value. He must produce surplus value for a capitalist. In other words, serve capital's process of self-valorization in order to be productive. Now, to use an example from outside the sphere of material production, a schoolmaster would be productive if, in addition to working on children's minds, he worked himself to the bone, making an entrepreneur wealthy. Whether the entrepreneur has put his money into a learning factory or a sausage factory, the relation between him and the worker will be the same. The concept of the productive worker thus implies not only a relation between an activity and its useful effects, or between the worker and the product of his labor, but also a specific social relation of production that turns the worker into capital's direct means of valorization. Being a productive worker isn't then something to celebrate. It is a misfortune. Volume 4 of this book, which deals with the theory's history, will show in greater detail that classical political economy has always made the production of surplus value out to be the productive worker's distinguishing value. Accordingly, as political economy has altered its understanding of surplus value, it has also changed its definition of the productive worker. The production of absolute surplus value and the production of relative surplus value initially presented themselves to us as two different kinds of production arising at different points in capital's historical development. What needs to happen before absolute surplus value can be produced? The things required to perform a given type of labor have to be transformed into capital, and the workers themselves have to be transformed into wage laborers. Products have to be performed as commodities or for the purpose of exchange. The production process has to be, at the same time, the process whereby capital consumes labor power, which means that it has to be carried out under the direct control of a capitalist. And finally, the labor process, that is, the workday, has to be extended past the point where the worker produces merely as an equivalent of the value of his labor power. If we presuppose that the general conditions of commodity production are in place, then all the production of absolute surplus value entails is this: the workday is extended beyond the labor time necessary to maintain the worker, and capital appropriates the surplus labor. This process can be based on traditional modes of industry that capital played no historical role in perpetuating. In such cases, what occurs is a purely formal metamorphosis. The capitalist mode of production differs from the slave system, for example, only in that force was used to extract surplus labor from workers, but now the voluntary sale of labor power mediates its extraction. So the production of absolute surplus value presupposes only the formal subsumption of labor under capital. The production of relative surplus value presupposes the production of absolute surplus value, and thus also the general form of production that goes with it, namely the capitalist form. In the production of relative surplus value, the goal is to increase surplus value by shortening the necessary labor time, and to do so independently of productive powers. No, to do so independently of the limits of the workday. The capitalist achieves this goal by increasing labor's productive powers, which requires that the labor process be revolutionized. It no longer suffices to extend that process. It must be remade. The production of relative surplus value therefore presupposes a specific capitalist mode of production whose methods, means, and other prerequisites spontaneously arise and develop only once the formal subsumption of labor under capital has occurred. Labor's real subsumption under capital then takes the place of its formal subsumption. Here we only need to mention the hybrid forms in which direct force isn't used to extract surplus value from the actual producers, and the producers still haven't become formally subordinate to capital. In other words, capital hasn't yet gained a direct control over the labor process. Take, for example, the usurer or merchant who appeared on the scene alongside independent producers performing craft labor or farm work in traditional ancestral ways before the mode of capitalist production. His usury capital or merchant capital fed on them like a leech. This form of exploitation couldn't predominate under the capitalist mode of production, but it could serve as a transitional form, as in fact it did towards the end of the medieval period. Finally, these hybrid forms were sometimes reproduced as byproducts of large-scale industries, albeit with a completely new physiognomy, as in the case of modern domestic industry showed. Labor's merely formal subsumption under capital suffices for the production of absolute surplus capital. All that needs to happen here is that the artisan who previously worked for himself, or the apprentice who used to work for a guild master, as a in the guild context, has to work as a wage laborer under the direct control of a capitalist. As we have seen, however, the methods for producing relative surplus value are at the same time ways to produce absolute surplus value. In fact, the heedless extension of the workday appeared as large-scale industry's most characteristic product. The specific capitalist mode of production generally ceases to be a mere means of producing relative surplus value the moment it takes control of a whole branch of industry, and this tendency becomes even more pronounced once it has come to dominate all the important branches. The capitalist mode is now the universal form of the production process, reigning supreme in a given society. It still functions as a particular method for producing relative surplus value only in the following two ways. First, insofar as it continues to take over the industries that have only been formally subordinate to capital, i.e., insofar as it continues to propagate itself, and second, insofar as changes in the methods of production keep revolutionizing the industries that have succumbed to it already. From a certain standpoint, the difference between absolute and relative surplus value seems illusory. Relative surplus value is absolute since it requires an absolute extension of the workday beyond the labor time needed to maintain the worker, while absolute surplus value is relative since it requires an increase in labor's productivity that makes it possible to limit the necessary labor time to one part of the workday. But when we look at the actual movement of surplus value, this semblance of identity vanishes. If labor's productive power and its normal intensity are fixed, the only way to raise that rate of surplus value is to extend the workday in absolute terms. However, when the length of the workday is fixed, the rate of surplus value will increase only if a change occurs in the relative magnitudes of the workday's two parts, that is, necessary labor and surplus labor. If wages haven't been driven below the value of labor power, this change presupposes that either labor's productivity or its intensity has changed. Let's say a worker has to spend all his time producing the means of subsistence that he and his family need in order to maintain themselves. He wouldn't be able to perform uncompensated labor for a third person. Labor has to reach a certain level of productivity before the worker has disposable time that can be used for that. Without such excess time, there can be no surplus labor and thus no capitalist class. Capitalist production cannot exist until labor achieves a certain degree of productive power, as was the case with all earlier modes of production that involved one part of society working not only for itself, but also for the other part. We can therefore say that surplus value has a natural foundation, but is natural only in the general sense that no absolute natural barrier prevents a person from saddling someone else with the labor his own existence requires. Now, it'd be quite wrong to see a mystical something in this spontaneously arising productivity, as people occasionally have. Only once human beings have lifted themselves out of their earliest animal state and their labor has become social to some extent, do relations emerge, whereby the surplus labor one person performs becomes the condition of another's existence. Labor's acquired productive power is still meager at the dawn of civilization, but so are the wants and needs that develop along with and out of the very means through which they are satisfied. Moreover, the part of society that lives from the work of others is at this point vanishingly small compared to the number of direct producers. The former population increases in both relative and absolute terms as labor's social productivity does. In fact, the capital relation grows out of economic soil that is the product of a long process of development. That is, the circumstance from which that relation proceeds. Labor's existing productivity is a gift from history, not nature. If we set aside how far the form of social production has advanced, labor's productivity depends on natural conditions, which can all be traced back to the nature of human beings, such as their race and to the natural world around them. Economically speaking, external natural conditions belong to one of two large classes. First, natural wealth in the means of subsistence, that is, fertile soil, bodies of water teeming with fish, and so on. Second, natural wealth in the means of labor, such as powerful waterfalls, navigable rivers, wood, metal, coal, and so on. When civilization is in its earliest stages, the first type of natural wealth matters most. In advanced societies, the second type does. Compare England with India, or in the ancient world, Athens and Corinth with the nations along the coast of the Black Sea. Oh, Corinth, I'm sorry. Comparing England with India, or in the ancient world, Athens and Corinth with the nations along the coast of the Black Sea. The smaller the number of natural needs that absolutely have to be satisfied, and the greater the natural fertility of the soil and kindness of the climate, the smaller the amount of labor time needed to maintain and reproduce the producers. The greater, in turn, the amount of labor the producers can perform for others beyond the labor that they perform for themselves. This was known to be so as far back as Diodorus's day. He remarked about the Egyptians, quote, "They feed their children in a sort of happy-go-lucky fashion that in its inexpensiveness quite surpasses belief, for they serve them with stews made of any stuff that is ready to hand and cheap, and give them such stalks of the biblos plant as can be roasted in the coals, and the roots and stems of marsh plants, either raw or boiled or baked. And since most of the children are reared without shoes or clothing because of the mildness of the climate of the country, the entire expense incurred by the parents of a child until it comes to maturity is not more than 20 drachmas. These are the leading reasons why Egypt has such an extraordinarily large population, and it is because of this fact that she possesses a large number of great monuments," unquote. And yet, the great building projects of ancient Egypt owe less to the sheer size of the population than the fact that such a large part of it was available to work on them. An individual worker can supply more surplus labor when his necessary labor time is reduced, and just so, the smaller the part of the general population needed to produce society's means of subsistence, the larger the part available for other kinds of labor. Let's suppose we're dealing with the capitalist mode of production. The length of the workday is fixed, and all other circumstances remain constant. The magnitude of the surplus labor produced will vary as labor's natural conditions do, especially the fertility of the soil. The inverse, however, doesn't follow. The place with the most fertile soil is by no means destined to be the one where the capitalist mode of production thrives most readily. That mode of production presupposes that human beings have come to rule over nature, and where nature lavishes its gifts upon a person too freely, it guides him by the hand like a child on leading strings. There, in other words, human development isn't a natural necessity. Thus, a temperate climate, not the tropics, with their lush vegetation is capital's motherland. The natural foundation for the social division of labor is the variety of the soil or the diversity of its natural products, not its absolute fertility. For when people live in varying natural conditions, this motivates them to multiply their wants and needs, their skills, and the means and methods of their labor. While the need to collectively control a natural force and thereby work more efficiently, the need to appropriate or tame such a force by applying human labor on a large scale has played a decisive role in the history of industry. Witness the water regulation projects in Egypt, Lombardy, and Holland. Or take India and Persia, where irrigation through artificial canals has supplied the soil with not only the water it needs, but also fertilizing minerals from the mountains, which are carried along in sediment. The secret behind the economic success Spain and Sicily enjoyed under Arab rule was nothing other than irrigation. Favorable natural conditions bring about only the possibility, never the reality, of surplus labor, and thus also surplus value or surplus product. Labor's different natural conditions are responsible for the fact that the same amount of labor goes farther toward satisfying wants and needs in some countries than in others. They cause the necessary labor time to vary from place to place when all other conditions are the same. But natural conditions affect surplus labor only as a natural limit that determines the point where labor for others can begin, and this limit recedes in proportion to the advance of industry. In Western European societies, workers must pay a price in order to be allowed to work for their own existence. Namely, they must supply surplus labor. And someone living there might easily imagine that providing surplus product is an inborn quality of human labor. But let's look at an inhabitant of the East Indies, where sago grows wild in the forests. When the inhabitant has satisfied himself by boring a hole in the trunk that the pith is ripe, the trunk is cut down and divided into several pieces. The pith is scraped out, mixed with water, and strained, and there is sago meal perfectly ready for use. A tree commonly yields 300 pounds and may afford 500 pounds or 600 pounds. Thus, a man goes into the woods and cuts his bread as we hew our firewood. Now, suppose an East Indian bread cutter can satisfy all his wants and needs by performing 12 hours of labor a week. What nature has given him directly is a lot of leisure time. A whole series of historical circumstances have come into being before he will use that time productively for himself. A source of external coercion has to be in place before he will spend it performing surplus labor for someone else. If capitalist production were introduced, this good man might have to work 6 days a week to appropriate for himself the product of one workday. Nature's generosity doesn't explain why he now works 6 days a week, supplying 5 days of surplus labor. It explains only why his necessary labor time would be limited to 1 day. But however much or little he works, his surplus product won't arise from some inborn occult quality of human labor. Like the social productive powers of labor that are products of history, the powers determined by nature appear as productive powers of the capital that labor is incorporated into. Let me read the footnotes that are part of this footnote 1. The very existence of the master capitalist as a distinct class is dependent on the productiveness of nature. If each man's labor were but enough to produce his own food, there would be no property. Number 2, among the wild Indians in America, almost everything is laborers. 99 parts of 100 are to be put upon the account of labor. In England, perhaps the laborer has not. Number 3, footnote 3, Diodorus Siculus, and it's an editor's note on where it comes from. Number 4, the first natural wealth, as it is most noble and advantageous, so doth it make the people careless, proud, and given to all excesses. Whereas the second enforceth vigilancy, literature, arts, and policy. Nor can I conceive a greater curse upon a body of people than to be thrown upon a spot of land where the productions for subsistence and food were, in great measure, spontaneous, and the climate required or admitted little care for raiment and clothing. There may be an extreme on the other side. A soil incapable of produce by labor is quite as bad as a soil that produces plentifully without any labor. Number 5, the Egyptians needed to be able to calculate the Nile's rise and fall, and this is what led to the invention of Egyptian astronomy, and along with it, the priestly castes' role as the highest authorities and policymakers in agriculture. The solstice is the time of the year when the Nile begins to rise, and the one the Egyptians had to observe with the utmost attention. It was this tropical year that they needed to track in order to direct their agricultural operations. So they had to look to the sky for an apparent sign of its return. Number 6, footnote 6, one of the material foundations of state power over India's unconnected small organisms of production was the regulation of the water supply. The Mohammedan rulers in India understood this better than their English successors. We need only to think of the famine of 1866, which took the lives of more than 1 million Hindus in the Orissa district of the Bengal presidency. The Bengal, whatever presidency. Number 7, there are no two countries which furnish an equal number of the necessities of life in equal plenty and with the same quality of labor. Men's wants increase or diminish with the severity or temperateness of the climate they live in. Consequently, the proportion of trade which the inhabitants of different countries are obliged to carry on through necessity cannot be the same, nor is it practicable to ascertain the degree of variation farther than by the degrees of heat and cold, from whence one may make this general conclusion that the quantity of labor required for a certain number of people is greatest in cold climates and least in hot ones. Or, for in the former, men not only want more clothes, but the earth more cultivating than in the latter. J. Massey wrote this epoch-making anonymous work. Hume took his theory of interest from it. Number 8, all labor must, this is apparently part of the citizens' rights and duties, leave a surplus. This is Proudhon. Number 9, a reference to F. Shaw, Die Erde, die Pflanze und der Mensch. That is Joachim Friedrich Shaw, The Earth, Plants, and Man's Popular Pictures of Nature. Now, there is, of course, and it isn't very long here, so I'll finish that, the editor's notes for Chapter 14, which, as I said before, is the probably the meat of the editing process in terms of giving us a more semantic element of what is this chapter is about. Chapter 14, absolute and relative surplus value. The editor's notes, lowercase 1. What owners call profit and landlords call rent, Marx, using a term he borrowed from followers of David Ricardo, calls surplus value. He once said his own theory of surplus value was the most radical contribution to political economy, bar none. This is a letter to Engels of August 1867. The theories that came before his willfully ignored the most important aspect of this basic product of the capital system, namely the way that it is produced value. And although he critiques previous theories in the published Volume I, he reserves an entire book for a full attack on the classical political economists and their theories. Marx seems to have thought of the text, now known as Theories of Surplus Value, as the historical part of his project, because it mapped changes over time to the concept of the extra a capital system generates. Notebook 6 through 15 plus Notebook 18, the texts out of which the volume Theories of Surplus Value was assembled, posthumously give an intricate history of the theories, focusing mainly on Adam Smith and Ricardo, but also bringing other political economists like James Stewart and Kenney into evidence, along with pamphleteers like Thomas Hodgkin and Percy Ravenstone, laying out a history that runs from the late 17th century to Marx's present day. Marx never prepared these texts for publication or even revised them. After his death, Engels set in motion a plan to publish Theories of Surplus Value, although it wasn't actually accomplished until Karl Kautsky, yes, that Karl Kautsky, edited and published the material in 3 volumes between 1905 and 1910, which I assume is the basis for the Soviet version. Number 2, lowercase 2. Editor's note. Although it gets only a brief mention here, real subsumption, along with its companion concept, formal subsumption, was discussed in an important section from the 1861 to 63 drafts that has become to be known as the unpublished Chapter 6. Marx's title, Results of the Direct Production Process, indicates what he is after there. Now, once the idea of capital is fully taken over and the production of products has been fully transformed into the production of value, when, that is, everyone agrees that production is not first and foremost for making useful goods to secure human existence, but instead for making value to secure the continued existence of the system, the worker's relationship to production changes dramatically. No longer independent actors, they become subsumed into the labor process in two ways. They become formally subsumed through the coercive practices of managers who need to control workers' time and movements in order to increase productivity. You might call this supervised efficiency. More horrifying was the second kind of subsumption Marx theorized next. Workers become, more than formally, really subsumed into the labor process when their individual feelings, thoughts, and goals become indistinguishable from the goal of value creation, when in effect they regulate themselves and take productivity as a personal rather than a systemic aim. A kind of capitalist superego forms. Today we sometimes call this loving your work. Lowercase numeral 3, editor's notes. Marx is borrowing and reworking a line from Friedrich Leopold Graf Stolberg's poem To Nature, An die Natur. Leite mich an deiner Hand wie ein Kind am Gangelband. In the poem, the speaking I asks nature to maintain control and is ready to forfeit all independence. Lowercase 4, editor's notes. The term translated as this good man is der Brave. The idea that being that Marx is using a nominalized form of the adjective brave, B-R-A-V, which means good or upstanding. But there's another possibility. Marx also employed English terms in context like the one in question, and he wasn't always very precise in doing so. Perhaps then the word he had in mind is English noun brave, B-R-A-V-E, even though it has traditionally signified North American Indian warrior, unquote. Okay, so that is my little rendering today, and I'm getting close to the end of my little time here, and I've included, as I said, the Ed George notes, not very long and worth reading because it does hopefully synopsize or simplifies what I just read. And then, of course, Harry Cleaver's outline of Marx's analysis and commentary. I will put the outline in there. It's only about 10 lines. Sorry, I didn't include that. It's the way the page is set up, but I included the commentary as well. I also included a little diagram to remind you what absolute and relative surplus value look like. Number one is absolute surplus value, and number two is relative surplus value and its relation to the working day. And then finally, a video in case you needed something a little bit more, whatever, idiomatic or didactic. So that's that. Now I will stop and see whether there are any comments. Is this antagonism counter to our nature? Well, that's an interesting question. I would assert that, and I would assume that that's why Marx looked more at the anthropological elements to work through, and this is why I was interested in Darwin. I'm sure this question of fitness, this that we do need to come in conflict in order to achieve certain aims is probably important. And yes, subsumption enabled by, carried out via sublation. Yes, that's probably the best way. One is a abstraction of the other that is more direct, which I kind of tried to imply before, but probably screwed that up. Let's see what else. Yeah, sausage factories. Formal precedes the real in the sense that formal is, of course, you want to think of it probably in a Hegelian way that, you conceive of the formal and then you apply it to, the world. This is the difference between theory and practice or theory and praxis, right? Then yes, there's the invisible hand is lurks there. And you need to say, well, Adam Smith is lurks there from the 18th century. Opium crop squeezed out rice. People got high and starved. That's quite amusing. Yes, hello to Joe. Brave Braves, etc. Thank you very much. Okay, I will stop the share and stop the live stream. Let me thank you for your attention. This was chapter 14. This is the Autonomous Collective. Tomorrow will be chapter 15 of Karl Marx, Volume 1 Capital, chapter 15, the 20